morning, good afternoon, and good night. I'm KT, and this is what happened. Tonight, we're going to continue. Is this the worst family in the Bible? Part 3. Yes, we've got more. This is going to be the last part. We're going to talk about the brothers. We talked about in part 2 how Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. So we're going to get into his brothers. He had 11 brothers. We're going to talk about some of them. And he had one sister who doesn't get brought up enough, in my opinion. We're going to talk about her as well. So if you're interested to hear more about the lives of some of the brothers who sold their brother into slavery, sit back, relax, and go with me to part 1 called Family Ties. The first brother I want to talk about is the oldest brother, Rueben. Rueben was good and he was bad. You already know that Rueben was on board with harming his brother Joseph, but he didn't want to him. He actually talked his brothers out of him. He was like, let's just put him in the pit and let him starve. But Rueben did, I believe, plan to go back and get him. So when he came back and found that his brothers had sold Joseph out the pit, he actually tore his clothes in anguish. Rueben was also the brother who agreed to give his 2 sons' lives up for his brother Benjamin if he didn't bring him back safely when Joseph wanted him to bring him to Egypt when he was testing them. So he had some good qualities. But let's talk about a young Rueben. You will remember from part 1, which I will link both parts at the end. In part 1, you know that Jacob had 2 wives. He had Leah and he had Rachel. Now, I interpret Leah's maidservant to have been his wife. He had a wife or a concubine named Bilhah. Bilhah had children by Jacob. So Reuben's, a couple of his younger brothers, their mother was Bilhah, his father's wife concubine. Y'all, one day when Jacob was away, Rueben slept with Bilhah. Needless to say, word got back to Jacob. And when he heard about it, he was so angry that he stripped Reuben's birthright as the oldest son. Rueben paid a steep price for that nookie. So yeah, that's why I'm calling this section Family Ties. But let's go on to talk about Judah. Judah was the 4th born son, I believe. So let's talk about Judah as an adult. He married a woman named Shua. She was a Canaanite. Judah had 3 sons by her. In order, they were Er, Onan, and Shelah. When Judah's oldest son, Er, got old enough, Judah found him a wife. Her name was Tamar. You're gonna remember Tamar after this story, honey. The thing with Er was, he was considered wicked in the sight of God, so God him. And that was that. Tamar was still here, young, ready to be a wife. So Judah told his second son, Onan, hey, go to Tamar, your brother's widow. You marry her, you get her pregnant, and that child will actually really be Er's child. Like you're having a child in the name of your brother. Well, Onan was like, okay, but really he didn't want to do that. And I'll be honest, I don't blame him, but he didn't want to do that. So he went and he had relations with her. That's sexual healing. But baby, long story short, he pulled out. He ejaculated on the ground. Apparently, God didn't like this, and bloop, he Onan too. Baby, that's 2 down. So now his youngest son, Shelah, was not old enough to be married. So Judah went to Tamar and he said, Tamar, I'm going to send you back to your father's house. You will function like a widow. And when Shelah is old enough, I will send him to you to marry you and y'all will have children. So Tamar said, okay, I'll go to my father's house. And she did, and she wore her black. As time went by, Judah and his wife, Shua, had a daughter. Unfortunately, this daughter passed away. So they were both grieving. Judah, in his grief, decided that he was going to go hang with his friend, a sheep shearer. At the same time, his youngest son, Shelah, has become what the Bible says of age to get married. Tamar is sitting over at her daddy's house like, now Shelah old enough, but Judah has not sent him over here to me. It so happened that a friend of hers says, Tamar, I heard that Judah is going to see his friend, the sheep shearer, I assume in the mountain or something, but your girl KT is making that part up. Possibly. But anyway, he will be leaving home to go there. So Tamar decided, I got a plan. She took off all her widow clothes. She decided to dress like a harlot. She put on the clothes. She put the drapes around her face and head so that they were covered. And she went and sat on the route that leads to Judah's friend's house. Judah is her father-in-law, let me remind you. When Judah comes upon her, he decides, oh, I want to sleep with that harlot. They call it a harlot in the Bible. Y'all, it's just a sex worker or a prostitute, right? He decides that's what he wants to do. So he asks her, hey, what is the cost to lay with you? She said, this is the words of the Bible, to come into me, what do you have? And he said, well, I've got a baby sheep, but I would have to have my friend send it and I can give you that. She said, okay, but how do I know you're good for your word? I need something like collateral, basically. You go to the bank, you ask for a loan, they want collateral. He gave her his signet ring, which y'all know by now in these Bible stories what that signet ring means, his cord or belt and a staff. So she she had 3 items for him. It was a dundada. What he called came into her. And guess what, y'all? From that encounter, she got pregnant. She went about her way. So when Judah got to his friends, he was like, hey, go take that sheep to the harlot on the side of the road that I slept with. And he did go do that. But when he got there was no harlot. So he came back to Judah, his friend. He came back and was like, hey, there's no harlot on the road. And he's like, look, you're not going to embarrass me. You're going to pay this woman. So Judah went down himself and she wasn't there. So he asked like the townspeople, where's the harlot that be on the road? And they said, don't no harlot be on the road over here. Are you stupid? You came up here to get some sheep from being sheared. Ain't no women around here like that. So anyway, he just kind of called it like, dang, I can't find her. He was upset that he couldn't pay her because he was a man of honor. The man who had a wife and they had just lost the baby girl who was sleeping with what he thought was a prostitute. He goes home and about his business. A few months goes by and some people come tell Judah, hey, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, she was being a harlot and a prostitute and she got pregnant. And he said, bring her to me because I'm finna her right now because she got some nerve. So he already a hypocrite, y'all, because he wasn't sleeping with what he thought was a harlot a few months ago. So she came before him and he thought he was finna do some neck chopping, but no, he's like, oh, you pregnant, huh? By some harlotry? That's what they called it, harlotry, honey. And she said, well, let's see, do you know who these things belong to? Here's your cord, a staff, and here's a signet ring. And Judah said, damn, that's mine. That ain't what he said, y'all. But he was like, yep, that's mine. That's mine. He had no choice but to acknowledge her. And he certainly couldn't her. But Judah did say this. He said, Tamar, even though she tricked me, she has been more righteous than I've been because I promised her my youngest son. And when he came of age, I didn't deliver it. So I will give Judah some credit for at least acknowledging that he ain't ish. I mean, he didn't acknowledge other stuff, but you know what I mean. Time went on and she went into labor. It was twins. And one of the twins reached their hand out because baby childbirth is horrific. I said it. But anyway, the midwife put a cord on the baby's hand that was exposed so that they would know, like a red cord, this is the oldest. So you know which twin deserves the birthright until you can tell them apart by personalities. The baby's hand went back in and somehow the other baby came out first. And the midwife said, how did you breach first? And so they named the baby Perez, which literally means breach or breakthrough. And the other baby's name was Zerah. So that was Judah's story. Judah had 6 kids, but the daughter died, so he had 5 sons, and 2 were by his daughter-in-law. So yeah, family ties. That said, let's go on into part 2, which I'm gonna call What is Just? To talk about what is just, or what does justice deserve to see, we gotta talk about Joseph's only sister, Dinah. Dinah's story ties into Joseph's brothers, which are her brothers, Simeon and Levi. At some point in part 1, when we are talking about Jacob, the father, we talk about how he settled in many places. So one of those places was Shechem. Dinah, the only daughter, she went out in Shechem to seek out the ladies of Shechem because she was looking for people to bond with and be friends with and get to know. And that probably wouldn't have been an uncommon thing to do. However, while looking for the women, she came upon the man named Shechem. So this can get a little confusing. But Shechem was a man whose father's name was Hamor, and he was a prince of Shechem. This turned out to be a horrible turn of fate for Dinah because Shechem promptly snatched her, took her back to his place. He did assault her. It was essentially kidnapping because he locked her in where she couldn't escape. I don't know if his father, Hamor, the prince, was trying to mitigate the damage or if he was just stupid, but when he found out about it, he went to Jacob and he said, Jacob, since you all are living here, you and your tribe, we should really merge. You should give us your daughters. And he didn't mean just his daughter Dinah. He meant the daughters of your tribe, and we'll give you our daughters, and let's be friends and be on this land together. But by the time he made it to them, her brothers and her father, they already had found out what had happened to Dinah. Again, Dinah is a captive at this point, so to add insult to pain and injury, you have her locked up. Before Jacob could even answer, and I don't even know if he even actually talked to Jacob, but either way, Simeon and Levi said, sure, that's no problem. Now, they were tricking this man already, so they said the only thing is we believe in circumcision, and that part was true. If you bring the men of your city to be circumcised, then they can marry our women. They did exactly that. Hamor sent the men who wanted to be married to the women from Jacob's tribe to be circumcised. They did the circumcisions and they waited 3 days. After 3 days, the men were sore. And as a side note, I've always heard this is worse as an adult. I guess you really can't speak on it if you're a child, but for sure, my son, we had that done at the hospital, baby. So they were nice and short, and that's when Simeon and Levi attacked. They took every man to sword. I'm talking about it was every man in the town, every one of them done. Jacob was extremely upset about this. He told them, your anger is out of control, and now what have you done? I have land here, I'm living here, and what if the Canaanites, and I think it was called the Perizzites or something like that, what if they come together and rise up against me? I won't be able to fight them. You put us in a horrible predicament. And I'm not gonna act like I don't understand what Jacob was saying, but I can ride for Simeon and Levi riding for their sister, because even in today's day, there are so many times where women aren't protected the way they should be. Then they surely weren't. I can really respect that they did this for their sister, even though we know that Simeon and Levi ain't ish, because they definitely sold their brother into slavery before this. And also, Simeon was the one that was held captive when Joseph said, one of y'all gonna stay here while you go bring back your other brother Benjamin. Simeon was a trip. Jacob wasn't wrong. They were wrong because they slaughtered people who had nothing to do with that. And this is another example of like leadership doing something and it affects people at the bottom, right? So they were wrong, but they freed their sister. So that's what happened with them, and that's their story. Another thing about Levi was the great grandfather of Moses and Aaron. Also, Simeon and Levi were the only tribes who didn't have designated land. One of their tribes worked the temple, and they never had a set home. Now again, Joseph had 11 brothers, so we're not going to talk about all of them. They all had roles to play. Other notable mentions were Joseph's brother Dan. Samson came from Dan's line. Zebulun, his people lived by the sea and they built ships, and certainly it became very lucrative. They also were known for staying out of wars. They decided to be traders and make their money and leave war alone. Those are all of Joseph's brothers that had really interesting stories. So let's go into our next part, which is my final thoughts. So these are my final thoughts. This family has been a very messy family, so much so that we had to cover it in 3 videos. However, I'm really happy that we were able to talk about Joseph's brothers, because in my opinion, as someone who grew up in church, and I know every denomination is probably different, but I just never really heard people talk much about Joseph's brothers. I think that Rueben is an example of how you can make really bad decisions, sometimes horrible choices, and then show signs of change and redemption once you really see what you are. And I think Rueben showed that. We saw that he was willing to wait. Is that not selfish to be willing to sacrifice your sons? Because we talked about that with Jacob's daddy Isaac. But let me get back on task, because baby, this Bible would throw you. I'm just being honest. It's a lot of things that I've questioned in the Bible. I am a person of faith, but I do question things because some things are just wrong to me and it just doesn't seem right and it doesn't make sense. And I'll never blindly go along with things. But I think that was Reuben's character too. He would try to go along to get along, but also he had a line that he wouldn't cross. And when it got crossed, he would be hurt and he would try to figure out how to make it better, and he would feel shame for when he did wrong. From Levi and Simeon, we learned the effects that anger can have and the consequences that it can have. So on one hand, they were riding for their sister as they should, but should you really the whole city? I just think it's another example of a prince and his son in power who did something atrocious, and the people who are just trying to work, live, and have their families pay for it. Could they have just sheeped him and the prince, his daddy, who tried to cover for him? Maybe. I think that's what they should have done, but they took the whole town out, and some of the horrible decisions they made led them to some serious consequences in life. But ultimately, their tribes lived on. Also, Judah being tricked into sleeping with his daughter-in-law. I think sometimes the way the Bible tells the story about Tamar makes a lot of the blame be put on her. I think that sometimes this family got too connected and sometimes they weren't connected enough. And I think that both things can have dire consequences on a family. So my overall thoughts on this family as a whole, is this the worst family in the Bible? Oh, they were pretty horrible to each other at times. They also have redeeming moments. They're probably not the worst, because we're going to get into it as we get into it on this channel. Trust me, I do think this story as a whole is a story of accountability and what happens when you don't take responsibility for your actions. What can happen when you do acknowledge your wrongdoings and try to do better? What can happen when you ignore big issues that are right in front of you? And I'm talking all the way back to, we started at Isaac. And what can happen when you have bad parenting? What happens when you have good parenting? There are so many lessons. Definitely check out the previous videos videos and my thoughts on that. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I love to communicate in the comments. In conclusion, it was my pleasure to reread these verses in Genesis to bring you the story of, is this the worst family in the Bible? And until next time, remember, keep learning, be happy, and always have a blessed day. Bye bye.